Sometimes the most dangerous creatures need saving most. In the brutal 1800s frontier, one lonely cowboy was about to learn that compassion could be his deadliest choice. When a fierce storm drives him to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin, he discovers a massive mountain lion inside, weak from hunger but still deadly. Most men would reach for their rifle. Instead, this cowboy makes a decision that changes everything. He chooses to save the beast that could destroy him. Word spreads through the village like wildfire. Fear turns to outrage. Townspeople demand the animal be destroyed. But when bandits threaten their home, the creature they feared becomes their unexpected savior. What happens when compassion meets the brutal reality of the Old West? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant snow across the Montana Territory, whispering through the tall grass like voices from another time. Jacob McAllister pulled his worn hat lower over weathered features and guided his mare along the familiar ridge that overlooked Millfield Valley. At 53, he had walked this land for more than half his life. Yet today, something felt different, heavier, like the air before a storm. His hands, scarred from decades of hard work and harder choices, held the reins with the easy confidence of a man who had learned to read the language of horses and wind. The mare, a gentle sorrel named Grace, responded to his slightest touch. She had been his constant companion for 8 years now, ever since he had found her abandoned and half-starved near a burned-out homestead. Like him, she had learned to survive alone. The valley spread below them in shades of gold and amber, punctuated by the dark ribbon of Millfield Creek. Smoke rose from chimneys in the small settlement that had grown around the trading post and general store. From this distance, the town looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but Jacob knew better. He had seen enough settlements rise and fall in his lifetime to understand that peace was often just the quiet between storms. His cabin sat apart from the rest, a quarter-mile up the hillside where the pine trees grew thick and the morning sun caught the windows just right. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch where he spent his evenings watching the world settle into darkness. He had built it with his own hands 12 years ago, after deciding that solitude was preferable to the complications that seemed to follow him in towns. The decision to live apart hadn't been made lightly. Jacob carried the weight of choices that had shaped him into someone who found it easier to trust animals than people. His past was a patchwork of moments, both heroic and haunting. A war that had taken too many good men, a failed marriage that had taught him about love and loss, and a series of jobs that had gradually pushed him further from civilization and deeper into himself. He dismounted near the cabin and began the familiar ritual of caring for Grace, unsaddling, brushing, feeding. These simple tasks grounded him, reminded him that life was often about small acts of responsibility rather than grand gestures. The mare nickered softly as he worked, a sound of contentment that filled the quiet spaces in his heart. Inside the cabin, everything was exactly as he had left it that morning. His bed was made with military precision, a habit from his army days that he had never been able to shake. Books lined one wall, volumes on agriculture, animal behavior, and philosophy that he read by lamplight during the long winter evenings. A worn leather journal lay open on the small table by the window, its pages filled with his careful handwriting. The journal had become his confidant over the years, the repository for thoughts too complex or too personal to share with anyone else. In it, he recorded observations about the changing seasons, notes about the animals he encountered, and sometimes, when loneliness pressed too heavily, reflections on the path that had brought him to this place. Today's entry was brief. Storm coming from the northwest. Grace is restless. Something in the air feels different, like the world is holding its breath. He had learned to trust these feelings. The frontier had a way of teaching a man to listen to subtle warnings, to pay attention to the things that city folks might dismiss as imagination. Animals knew when trouble was approaching. The wind carried messages for those who knew how to hear them. And sometimes a man's gut was the best compass he had. Jacob prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, eating alone, as he had for countless evenings. The silence didn't bother him anymore. Hadn't for years. He had made peace with solitude, had even come to prefer it. People were unpredictable, driven by fears and desires that often put them at odds with common sense. Animals, on the other hand, were honest in their intentions. They might be dangerous, but they were never deceptive. As darkness settled over the valley, he stepped onto the porch and lit his pipe, a ritual that marked the end of each day. The tobacco was a small luxury he allowed himself, something to occupy his hands and mind while he watched the stars emerge. Tonight, they seemed unusually bright, as if the approaching storm had cleared the air in preparation for its arrival. The sound of howling drifted up from the valley, not wolves, but the more unsettling cry of coyotes. They had been more active lately, driven closer to human settlements by hunger and the early approach of winter. Jacob had seen the signs during his rides around his property. Tracks that spoke of desperation, partially eaten carcasses that suggested competition for scarce resources. This was the reality of frontier life that Eastern folks rarely understood. Nature wasn't cruel, but it wasn't sentimental either. Survival required constant vigilance, practical skills, and sometimes difficult choices. It also required a certain hardness, not callousness, but the ability to do what was necessary without the luxury of endless deliberation. He thought about the other people in the valley, most of whom he knew by name, if not by friendship. There was Martha Henderson, who ran the general store with the fierce efficiency of a woman who had raised 4 children alone after her husband died in a mining accident. Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, who had lost his left arm in the war but could still work iron better than men half his age. Dr. Samuel Pierce, who had come west to escape something he never spoke about, but who had saved more lives than any man Jacob had ever known. These were good people, shaped by hardship into something stronger than their Eastern counterparts. They understood that life was precious precisely because it was fragile, that community mattered because the alternative was often death. But they also understood that some burdens had to be carried alone. Jacob knocked the ash from his pipe and headed inside. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, and he would meet it with the same steady resolve that had carried him through 5 decades of an unpredictable world. He had learned not to borrow trouble from the future, but he had also learned to be ready for it. He opened his journal one more time and added a final line. A man's character isn't defined by the storms he avoids, but by how he weathers the ones he can't escape. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the pines into a restless whisper. Grace whinnied softly from the stable, a sound that spoke of unease. Jacob blew out the lamp and settled into bed, but sleep was slow to come. Something was indeed different about tonight. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the darkness seemed to press against the cabin walls. The storm was coming, and with it, a test that would challenge everything he thought he knew about survival, about compassion, and about the thin line between civilization and the wild. But Jacob McAllister had never been a man to back down from a test, and he wasn't about to start now. In the distance, thunder rolled across the mountains like the sound of approaching cavalry, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm hit with the fury of a living thing. What had begun as a steady rain quickly transformed into a deluge that turned the mountain paths treacherous and sent creeks surging over their banks. Jacob had been checking his boundary markers when the sky opened up, leaving him miles from home, with Grace struggling against winds that bent the pine trees nearly horizontal. Lightning split the darkness every few seconds, followed by thunder. that echoed off the canyon walls like cannon fire. Jacob knew better than to seek shelter under the trees. He had seen what lightning could do to a man foolish enough to trust his life to tall timber. Instead, he guided Grace toward the old Thornton Place, an abandoned homestead he had passed many times but never explored. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its windows dark and door hanging at an odd angle. The Thornton family had left 3 years ago after their youngest boy died of fever, and the place had the hollow look of buildings that had been surrendered to the wilderness. But it had a roof and walls, which was more than Jacob could ask for in weather like this. He tied Grace to a sturdy post under what remained of a lean-to shelter, then approached the cabin with the caution that frontier life had bred into his bones. The door was unlocked. Who bothered locking doors when the nearest neighbor was miles away? And he pushed it open slowly, listening for any sounds that might indicate occupancy. What he heard made his blood turn cold. A low, rumbling growl came from somewhere in the darkness, followed by the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wooden floor. Jacob froze, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt at his hip. He had heard that sound before, in the Colorado Territory, just before. A grizzly had nearly ended his life, but this was different, deeper, more controlled. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cabin's interior for a brief moment, and in that instant, Jacob saw something that would change the course of his life forever. In the far corner, pressed against the wall like a cornered predator, was the largest mountain lion he had ever encountered. The animal's golden eyes reflected the lightning like twin lamps, and even in its obvious distress, it radiated a power that commanded respect. The cat was magnificent, easily 8 feet from nose to tail, with muscled shoulders that spoke of strength earned through survival in the harshest conditions. But Jacob's trained eye also saw the things that mattered more, the prominent ribs that indicated hunger, the way the animal favored its left hind leg, the dried blood matted in its fur along one flank. This was not a healthy predator looking for an easy meal. This was a creature fighting for its life. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to back away slowly, mount Grace, and find another shelter. Mountain lions were ambush predators, and an injured one was doubly dangerous. Every instinct honed by decades of frontier living told him to leave this cabin to its current occupant and take his chances with the storm. Instead, Jacob found himself stepping inside and slowly closing the door behind him. The action was so contrary to common sense that he almost questioned his own sanity. But something in the animal's eyes had stopped him, not aggression, but a kind of weary dignity that he recognized. He had seen it in the mirror on his worst days, the look of a creature that had been pushed to its limits but refused to surrender. Easy. There, he said softly, his voice barely audible above the storm. I'm not here to cause you trouble. The mountain lion's ears flattened against its skull, and its tail twitched in a warning that needed no translation. But it made no move to attack, and Jacob took this as a sign that perhaps the animal was too weak for aggression or simply smart enough to recognize that he represented neither immediate threat nor easy prey. He remained perfectly still, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Gradually, the cabin's interior revealed itself. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and in one corner, a small wooden horse that must have belonged to the Thornton boy. The toy served as a painful reminder of how quickly life could change, how dreams could be abandoned in the face of circumstances beyond human control. The mountain lion shifted slightly, and Jacob caught a glimpse of the wound that had brought the animal to this place. A deep gash ran along its left flank, probably from an encounter with another predator, or perhaps a fall among the rocks. The injury was several days old but showed signs of infection, red, swollen, and undoubtedly causing considerable pain. Jacob had treated wounds like this before, both on animals and men. He knew what it looked like when a living creature was losing the fight against infection, and he knew that without help, This magnificent animal would be dead within a week. The rational part of his mind catalogued all the reasons why helping was impossible. Mountain lions were unpredictable at the best of times, and injured ones were often desperate enough to attack anything that came near. Even if he could somehow treat the wound, there was no guarantee the animal wouldn't turn on him the moment. It regained its strength, and then there was the matter of what the townspeople would say when they learned he was harboring a predator that could threaten their livestock or their children. But Jacob had never been entirely rational when it came to suffering. It was a flaw in his character, or perhaps a strength, depending on how you looked at it. He had nursed wounded soldiers back to health during the war, knowing some of them would return to battle and possibly die anyway. He had rescued Grace, when any practical man would have put her out of her misery. Time and again, he had chosen compassion over common sense, and while it had sometimes cost him, it had also given him the few moments of genuine peace he had known. "You're in a fix, aren't you, friend?" he whispered, keeping his voice gentle and his movements minimal. Storm outside, infection inside, and nowhere safe to run. The mountain lion watched him with those unwavering golden eyes, and Jacob found himself wondering what the animal was thinking. Did it understand that he posed no immediate threat? Could it sense that he was fighting the same internal battle that had shaped so many moments in his life, the struggle between self-preservation and something deeper, more complicated? Thunder crashed overhead, so close that the cabin's walls seemed to shudder, and in that moment of brilliant illumination, Jacob made his decision. He would not leave this creature to die alone in an abandoned cabin, no matter what the consequences might be. "All right then," he said, settling slowly onto the floor several feet away from the animal. "Looks like we're going to be sharing this place for a while. The name's Jacob, and I'm going to try to help you whether you like it or not." The mountain lion's only response was a slight shift in position, but Jacob chose to interpret this as acceptance rather than preparation for attack. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury, sealing them both inside a situation that would test everything Jacob believed about courage, kindness, and the bonds that could form between the most unlikely companions. As he began to plan how he might approach the wounded animal, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, sitting in an abandoned cabin with a creature that could kill him with a single swipe of its paw, would define not only his own future, but the future of everyone in Millfield Valley. The storm had brought them together, but Jacob suspected that the real tempest was yet to come. Dawn came slowly to the mountain cabin, filtering through grimy windows in pale shafts that revealed the full scope of Jacob's predicament. The storm had passed, leaving behind the crystalline silence that follows nature's fury, but inside the abandoned Thornton place, tension hung as thick as morning mist. The mountain lion had not moved from its corner during the night. Jacob had dozed fitfully against the opposite wall, jerking awake each time the animal shifted or made the slightest sound. Now, in the grey light of morning, he could see the creature more clearly, and what he saw deepened his resolve. The infection had spread overnight. The wound along the cat's flank showed angry red streaks radiating outward, a sure sign that poison was working its way through the animal's system. Without treatment, the magnificent predator would be dead within days, possibly hours. Jacob rose slowly, every movement deliberate and non-threatening. The mountain lion's eyes tracked him, but there was less fire in them than there had been the night before. Pain and weakness were taking their toll. "I know you don't trust me," Jacob said softly, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he used with frightened horses. "Can't say I blame you, but that wound's going bad, and we both know what that means." He had seen enough battlefield infections to recognize the signs of impending systemic poisoning. The animal's breathing was slightly labored, and Jacob suspected fever was beginning to set in. Time was becoming the enemy. Moving with infinite care, he approached his saddlebags, which he had dragged inside during the night. The mountain lion's muscles tensed as he moved, but it made no aggressive gestures. Jacob chose to interpret this as progress, however small. From his pack, he withdrew a small medical kit, basic supplies he had carried since his army days, a bottle of whiskey for disinfectant, needle and thread, clean bandages, and a few herbs that Doc Pierce had taught him to recognize. It wasn't much, but it would have to suffice. The real challenge would be getting close enough to use any of it. Jacob settled back onto the floor and began tearing strips from his cotton shirt. The fabric was clean and would serve as makeshift bandages, but more importantly, the action demonstrated his intentions. He worked slowly, methodically, keeping up a steady stream of quiet conversation. "Had a horse once with a wound like yours," he said, his hands never stopping their careful work. "Caught her leg on some barbed wire during a stampede. Infection set in before I found her. Everyone said to put her down, save her the suffering. But she had something in her eyes. Same thing I see in yours. A refusal to quit. The mountain." Lion's ears flicked slightly at the sound of his voice, and Jacob took this as encouragement to continue. Took 3 weeks of constant care before she turned the corner. Had to clean that wound twice a day. Force her to eat when she didn't want to, stay up nights when the fever got bad. But she pulled through, lived another 12 years and had 6 foals. He finished preparing the bandages and set them aside, then uncorked the whiskey bottle. The sharp scent filled the cabin, and the mountain lion's nostrils flared as it caught the unfamiliar smell. "This is going to be the hard part," Jacob murmured, more to himself than to the animal. "For both of us." He had been in dangerous situations before, faced down armed men, survived attacks by wild animals, weathered storms that had claimed stronger men than himself. But this was different. This required a kind of courage he wasn't sure he possessed, the willingness to extend trust to a creature that could end his life in an instant. Jacob began moving forward, one careful inch at a time. The mountain lion's body coiled with tension, and a low growl rumbled in its throat, not aggressive but warning. The message was clear: approach at your own risk. "I hear you," Jacob said quietly, "and I respect what you're telling me, but we're past the point of playing it safe." When he was still 5 feet away, the mountain lion's paw lashed out in a warning swipe. The claws, each as long as Jacob's, fingers, whistled through the air where his hand would have been if he had moved any closer. The demonstration was both terrifying and oddly reassuring. The animal still had enough strength to defend itself, which meant the infection hadn't progressed as far as he had feared. Jacob retreated to his previous position, but didn't give up. Instead, he tried a different approach. From his saddlebags, he produced a piece of dried venison, part of his emergency rations. The mountain lion's nostrils flared again, and for the first time since Jacob had entered the cabin, something other than pain flickered in its eyes. Hunger. Jacob tore off a small piece of the meat and tossed it gently toward the animal, making sure it landed well within the cat's reach, but far enough away to avoid triggering a defensive response. The mountain lion regarded the offering suspiciously for several long moments before stretching its neck forward and sniffing delicately. The meat disappeared in a single bite, followed by what Jacob could have sworn was an expression of surprise. Perhaps the animal had been surviving on whatever small prey it could catch while injured, and the rich taste of properly cured venison was a reminder of better times. Jacob waited, then tossed another piece. This time the mountain lion didn't hesitate. "That's better," Jacob said approvingly. "Belly full of good food helps with healing, always has." Over the next hour he established a careful rhythm. A piece of meat, followed by patient waiting, followed by gentle conversation. Gradually, the mountain lion's posture began to relax. Though its eyes never left Jacob's face, the sun climbed higher, warming the cabin and making the infection's odor more noticeable. Jacob knew that time was his enemy, but he also understood that rushing the process could undo all his progress. Trust, once broken with a wild animal, was nearly impossible to rebuild. When the venison was gone, Jacob tried a different approach. He soaked one of his cloth strips in whiskey, wringing out the excess, and held it up where the mountain lion could see it. "This is medicine," he explained, as if the animal could understand every word. "It's going to hurt at first, but it'll help fight the poison in your system. I've used it on myself more times than I care to count." To demonstrate, he poured a small amount of whiskey on a minor scratch on his own hand, hissing slightly at the sting, but showing no fear of the liquid. The mountain lion watched this performance with what appeared to be intelligent interest. Whether it understood the purpose remained to be seen, but it didn't retreat when Jacob began moving forward again, the whiskey-soaked cloth in his outstretched hand. This time, he made it within 3 feet before the animal's warning growl stopped him. Close enough to see the full extent of the wound, to smell the sickness that was slowly claiming this magnificent creature's life. The gash was deeper than he had initially thought, and the edges were ragged with infection. Left untreated, the mountain lion would be dead by nightfall. Jacob met the animal's gaze directly, seeing in those golden eyes a reflection of his own determination. "All right, friend," he said quietly. "This is where we find out what we're both made of." The breakthrough came not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet persistence that had defined Jacob's approach to every challenge in his life. By midday, he had managed to clean the outer edges of the mountain lion's wound, working in careful stages that tested both his courage and the animal's tolerance. Each step forward had been earned through patience. First, the whiskey-soaked cloth touching the very edge of the infection, a warning growl, a moment of stillness, then acceptance. Then deeper cleaning, removing the debris and dead tissue that was feeding the poison in the animal's system. More growls, more pauses, but gradually, miraculously, the mountain lion began to understand that this strange human was trying to help. The moment that changed everything came when Jacob was building a small fire in the cabin's neglected fireplace. The stones were cold, the chimney partially blocked by years of neglect, but he managed to coax a modest flame from the dry kindling he had gathered from around the cabin. As warmth began to fill the small space, the mountain lion did something that made Jacob's heart skip. It moved, not away from him, as it had done every time he had approached, but closer. The animal rose stiffly and padded across the floor, settling down near the fire with a soft sigh that spoke of relief and exhaustion. For the first time since entering the cabin, they were sharing the same space without the electric tension of predator and prey. The mountain lion lay on its side, the infected wound clearly visible in the firelight, and Jacob found himself studying the magnificent creature with something approaching awe. This was no ordinary cat. Even weakened by injury and infection, it radiated a kind of dignity that commanded respect. Its coat, where it wasn't matted with blood and dirt, showed the golden perfection that made mountain lions the most beautiful predators in North America. But it was the intelligence in those amber eyes that struck Jacob most forcefully, an awareness that went beyond simple animal instinct. "You know, don't you?" Jacob said softly, settling onto the floor a comfortable distance away. "You understand that I'm trying to help." The mountain lion's ears flicked toward him at the sound of his voice, but it made no move to retreat. Instead, it seemed to relax even further, as if the combination of warmth and the man's presence had created the first safe space it had known in days. Jacob used this opportunity to observe the wound more carefully. The cleaning had helped, but the infection was still present, and the animal's labored breathing suggested that fever was beginning to take hold. He would need to do more aggressive treatment soon, or risk losing his patient to the poison coursing through its system. But first, he needed to build more trust. He reached into his pack and withdrew another piece of venison, this one larger than the previous offerings. Instead of tossing it toward the mountain lion, he placed it on the floor between them and slowly pushed it closer with a long stick. The cat watched this process with interest, then stretched forward and claimed the meat with delicate precision. "That's it from my winter stores," Jacob said conversationally. "Had to hunt for 3 days to bring down the deer it came from, but I figure you need it more than I do right now." The mountain lion finished the meat and then did something that nearly stopped Jacob's heart. It began to clean itself, licking its paws with the methodical care of a domestic cat. The gesture was so normal, so utterly ordinary, that it transformed the entire atmosphere in the cabin. This wasn't a monster or a mindless predator. This was simply an animal, a magnificent, powerful animal that had been pushed to the brink of survival and was now, perhaps for the first time in days, feeling safe enough to attend to basic needs. Jacob decided to test the boundaries of their new understanding. Moving very slowly, he shifted closer to the fire, reducing the distance between them to less than 4 feet. The mountain lion paused in its grooming to watch him, but when he made no aggressive moves, it returned to cleaning its fur. "I had a partner once," Jacob said, his voice taking on the reflective quality that came naturally in quiet moments. "Fellow named Samuel Chen, Chinese man who'd come west looking for gold, stayed to become the best tracker I ever knew, saved my life more times than I could count." The mountain lion's eyes remained fixed on him, and Jacob had the oddest sensation that the animal was actually listening to his story. Samuel had a way with wild animals that bordered on the supernatural, could gentle a wild horse in half the time it took anyone else, could call deer close enough to touch. When I asked him about it once, he told me something I never forgot. "Animals don't trust words, Jacob. They trust intentions." Jacob reached for another cloth strip and soaked it with whiskey, moving with deliberate slowness. He said that every living thing can sense when another creature means harm and when it means help. The trick is making sure your intentions are pure, because animals can see right through deception. The mountain lion watched as Jacob prepared the medicinal cloth, and when he began to move closer, it didn't retreat. The amber eyes remained alert but calm, as if the animal had made its own decision about Jacob's intentions. "I'm going to try to clean that wound properly now," Jacob said quietly. "It's going to hurt, and I'm sorry for that. But the alternative is worse for both of us." He reached out slowly, the whiskey-soaked cloth in his hand, and gently touched the edge of the infected gash. The mountain lion tensed but didn't pull away. Encouraged, Jacob began to clean the wound more thoroughly, removing the remaining debris and applying the disinfectant to the worst areas of infection. The animal endured the treatment with remarkable stoicism, only occasionally making soft sounds that spoke of discomfort rather than fear. When Jacob finished, the mountain lion settled back down by the fire and regarded him with what could only be described as gratitude. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, Jacob found himself in the surreal position of sharing comfortable silence with one of nature's most formidable predators. The mountain lion dozed fitfully by the fire, and Jacob kept watch, adding wood to the flames and periodically checking his patient's condition. The fever was still present, but the cleaning had helped. More importantly, the animal was eating and drinking the water Jacob provided, both encouraging signs that its body was fighting the infection. But Jacob knew that this was only the beginning. Word of his absence would eventually reach the valley below, and when it did, people would come looking. The thought of what might happen when they found him sharing shelter with a mountain lion sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. For now, though there was only this moment, a man and a wild animal finding common ground in the most unlikely of circumstances, proving that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from fighting, but from choosing to heal. 3 days had passed since the storm, and the mountain lion, whom Jacob had begun thinking of as Rex after the regal bearing that even illness couldn't diminish, was showing remarkable improvement. The fever had broken during the second night, and the infection was slowly retreating under Jacob's persistent care. What had begun as a desperate act of compassion was evolving into something deeper, more complex. Rex had begun responding to Jacob's voice, turning his great head when his name was called, even making soft, chuffing sounds that seemed almost conversational. The cat would follow Jacob's movements around the cabin with intelligent eyes and had taken to sleeping closer to the fire and to Jacob each night. This morning, Rex had actually stood and walked the length of the cabin without favoring his injured leg, the first time Jacob had seen him move without obvious pain. The wound was healing cleanly, the angry red streaks of infection fading to healthy pink. In another week, perhaps two, the mountain lion would be fully recovered. But as Jacob stepped outside the cabin to fetch more firewood, he discovered that their time was running out. Fresh hoofprints marked the muddy ground around the clearing, at least 3 horses from the look of it, and recent enough that the edges were still sharp. Someone had been here, probably yesterday, while Jacob was inside, tending to Rex. They had circled the cabin, examined the lean-to where Grace was sheltered, and judged by the depth of the prints in one area, had stopped for a considerable discussion. Jacob's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. People from Millfield were looking for him, and it wouldn't take them long to figure out he was holed up in the Thornton cabin. When they found him, they would also find Rex, and Jacob doubted that any explanation would prevent them from viewing the mountain lion as a threat that needed to be eliminated. He knelt to examine the tracks more closely, his frontier skills telling him a story he didn't want to hear. 2 of the horses carried heavy riders, probably Tom Bradley and his son Mark, both substantial men. The third set of prints were lighter, more delicate, and showed the distinctive wear pattern of Doc Pierce's mare. Samuel Pierce was not a man, given to unnecessary worry, which meant Jacob's absence had been noticed and was causing genuine concern in the valley. Standing slowly, Jacob found himself facing the hardest decision of an already difficult life. He could leave now, Mount Grace, and ride back to his own cabin with some story about seeking shelter from the storm. His friends would be relieved, life would return to normal, and no one would be the wiser. But that would mean abandoning Rex, and Jacob knew with grim certainty what would happen to the mountain lion once he was gone. Wounded or not, a predator this close to settled land would be hunted down and killed, probably within days of Jacob's departure. He looked back toward the cabin, where Rex was undoubtedly waiting for his return. In just 3 days, the animal had come to trust him completely, a trust that Jacob knew was precious and rare. Mountain lions were solitary creatures by nature, not given to forming bonds with other species. Yet somehow, in the space between life and death, something had grown between them that transcended the normal boundaries between human and wild animal. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Jacob had perhaps 2 minutes before the riders reached the clearing, 2 minutes to make a choice that would determine not only his own future, but the fate of the creature that had come to depend on him. He could hear voices now, familiar tones, carrying through the morning air. Doc Pierce's measured baritone, Tom Bradley's gruffer growl, and a third voice he didn't immediately recognize. They were moving slowly, probably following the same trail of broken branches and disturbed ground that Jacob had left during his desperate ride to find shelter. Jacob made his decision. He stepped back into the cabin, where Rex lifted his head from his position by the fire. The mountain lion's amber eyes met Jacob's, and in that gaze, Jacob saw complete trust, the kind of faith that could only exist between creatures who had faced mortality together and emerged changed. "Company's coming, friend," Jacob said quietly, settling down beside the cat, "and I'm afraid they're not going to understand what's happened here." Rex seemed to sense the tension in Jacob's voice. The cat's ears pricked forward and his nostrils flared as he caught scents from outside that didn't belong to their small sanctuary. The hoofbeats were closer now, close enough that Jacob could distinguish individual horses. He recognized the particular cadence of Doc Pierce's mare, the heavier tread of Tom Bradley's gelding. They would be in the clearing within moments. Jacob reached out and gently placed his hand on Rex's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath. The golden fur, The mountain lion leaned into the touch, a gesture that would have been impossible just days before, but now felt as natural as breathing. "Whatever happens," Jacob whispered, "I want you to know that these last few days have meant something, more than I thought possible." Rex made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and Jacob felt his heart clench with the knowledge of what was about to be lost. Outside, the horses had stopped. Jacob could hear the leather creak of saddles as the riders dismounted, could hear Tom Bradley's voice raised in concern. "Jacob, you in there, man? We've been looking all over creation for you." "His horse is here," came another voice. Young Mark Bradley, Jacob realized. "Looks like he's been here a while." "Jacob." This time it was Doc Pierce, his professional concern, evident even from outside. "Are you all right? The whole valley's been worried sick." Jacob looked down at Rex, who was watching the cabin door with the alert stillness of a predator assessing potential threats. The mountain lion was still weak, still recovering, but Jacob knew that if he felt cornered, Rex would fight with the desperate fury of any wild animal protecting its life. The thought of his friends, good, decent people who had risked their own safety to search for him, walking into a situation they couldn't possibly understand, filled Jacob with dread. These men would see only danger in Rex's presence, would react with the quick violence that frontier life had taught them was necessary for survival. Jacob stood slowly and walked to the door, his hand resting on the latch. Outside, his friends waited for some sign that he was alive and well. Inside, Rex watched him, with eyes that held a trust Jacob was about to betray. For a moment, Jacob hesitated, caught between two worlds, the predictable life of human community and the wild, impossible bond he had forged with a creature that by all rights should have been his enemy. Then he opened the door. The silence that followed Jacob's appearance in the doorway stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap under the weight of unspoken tension. Doc Pierce, Tom Bradley, and young Mark stood frozen in the clearing, their expressions shifting from relief to confusion to something approaching horror as they processed what they were seeing. Jacob knew how he must look. Unshaven, clothes torn and stained with blood, standing in the doorway of an abandoned cabin with the defensive posture of a man protecting something precious. What they couldn't see, couldn't yet comprehend, was the magnificent creature lying by the fire just inside the doorway. "Jacob," Doc Pierce said carefully, his medical training evident in the way he assessed Jacob's appearance from a distance. "Are you injured? You look—" "I'm fine, Sam," Jacob interrupted, his voice carrying a weight that made all three men stiffen with alertness. "But I need you all to listen very carefully before anyone moves or speaks." Tom Bradley's hand moved instinctively toward the rifle scabbarded on his saddle, a gesture born of 30 years of frontier living. "Jacob, what in hell's name is going on here? We've been searching for 3 days, thinking you might be lying, dead in a ravine somewhere. And we're mighty grateful to find you alive," Mark added, though his young face showed the same wariness that had overtaken the older men. "But why are you holed up in this old place? Why didn't you come home when the storm passed?" Jacob took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Behind him, he could sense Rex stirring, the mountain lion's acute senses picking up on the tension radiating from the humans outside. "There's someone else here," Jacob said quietly. "Someone who needed help, who would have died if I'd left him alone." The three men exchanged glances, and Jacob saw the moment when understanding began to dawn in Doc Pierce's eyes. The physician had treated enough animal attacks to recognize the signs: the blood on Jacob's clothes, the defensive posture, the careful way he blocked the cabin entrance. "Jacob," Doc Pierce said, his voice taking on the calm, professional tone he used when delivering difficult news. "What exactly are you protecting in there?" Before Jacob could answer, Rex appeared in the doorway beside him. The mountain lion moved with fluid grace despite his recent injury, his golden coat catching the morning sunlight as he settled into a position that was both protective and submissive, protecting Jacob while showing no aggressive intent toward the strangers. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Mark Bradley stumbled backward with a strangled cry, his hand flying to his sidearm. Tom Bradley had his rifle halfway out of its scabbard before Jacob's sharp voice stopped him. "Don't," Jacob commanded, stepping slightly in front of Rex. "He's not a threat. He's injured, recovering, and under my protection." "Sweet Jesus, Jacob," Tom breathed, his weathered face pale with shock. "That's the biggest damn cat I've ever seen. What in God's name possessed you to—" "He was dying," Jacob said simply. "Infected wound, fever, starving. I found him here during the storm, and I couldn't just walk away." Doc Pierce, to his credit, had not reached for a weapon. Instead, he was studying the scene with the analytical eye of a man of science, taking in Rex's calm demeanor, the obvious trust between man and animal, and the professional quality of the bandages visible beneath the cat's fur. "You treated his wounds," Doc Pierce observed, his voice carefully neutral. "How long has he been like this?" "Docile, I mean." 3 days, Jacob replied. "And he's not docile, Sam. He's grateful. There's a difference." Mark Bradley had recovered enough from his initial shock to find his voice, though it cracked with adolescent fear. "Pa, we can't just stand here talking. That thing could attack at any second. It's a mountain lion." "His name is Rex," Jacob said firmly, "and he's not that thing. He's a living creature who deserves the same respect you'd show any patient in Doc Pierce's office." Tom Bradley's face flushed red with a mixture of fear and anger. "Patient? Jacob, have you lost your mind? That animal is a killer by nature. It doesn't matter if you've patched up its wounds. The moment it gets hungry enough or feels threatened enough, it'll tear you apart without a second thought." "Like Grace did?" Jacob asked quietly, referring to his mare. "She was wild once, half-starved and crazy with fear when I found her. But I took the time to understand her, to earn her trust. How is this different? Because Grace is a horse." Tom exploded, his patience finally snapping. "Horses are prey animals, bred to work with humans. That thing is an apex predator that sees us as food." Rex stirred at the raised voice, his ears flattening slightly, but he made no move to stand or show aggression. Instead, he looked up at Jacob with those intelligent amber eyes, as if seeking reassurance that these loud strangers posed no threat to their partnership. Doc Pierce stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in his hands like a shield. "Jacob, I understand your compassion. It's one of the things I've always admired about you. But Tom's right about the danger. Even if this animal is grateful now, that gratitude won't override millions of years of predatory instinct." "You're wrong, Sam," Jacob said, reaching down to gently touch Rex's head. The mountain lion leaned into the contact, a gesture that made all 3 visitors take an involuntary step backward. This isn't about overriding instinct. It's about understanding it, respecting it, and finding common ground. Common ground? Mark's voice rose to near hysteria. "With a mountain lion, Pa, he's lost his mind. The fever, or something?" "I haven't lost anything," Jacob interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a respected leader during his military days. "If anything, I've found something I didn't know I was missing. This animal trusted me with his life, and I'm not going to betray that trust just because it makes other people uncomfortable." Tom Bradley shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Jacob, I've known you for 8 years, and I've never seen you make a foolish decision. But this is beyond foolish. This is dangerous, not just to you, but to everyone in the valley." "How do you figure that?" Jacob asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "Because word's going to get out," Doc Pierce said quietly. "You know it will. Someone will talk, and before you know it, every person in Millfield will know that Jacob McAllister is harboring a mountain lion. They'll want it destroyed, and if you refuse, they'll destroy me along with him," Jacob finished, understanding flooding through him like ice water. The 4 men stood in silence, the weight of unspoken consequences settling over the clearing. Like morning fog, Rex remained calm beside Jacob, unaware that his very existence had just become a threat to the only human who had shown him kindness. Finally, Doc Pierce spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "Jacob, you have to see reason. End this now, before it destroys you and everything you've built here." Jacob looked down at Rex, then back at the three men who had risked their own safety to search for him. These were his friends, his community, and they were asking him to choose between belonging and conscience. "I can't do that, Sam," he said quietly. "I won't do that." The die was cast, and Jacob knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The standoff in the clearing might have continued indefinitely, with stubborn resolve battling practical concern, if not for the thin column of black smoke that Mark Bradley spotted rising from the direction of Millfield Valley. "Pa," the young man said, his voice tight with new alarm as he pointed toward the distant smoke. "Look there, toward the settlement." All four men turned to follow his gaze, and what they saw sent a chill through Jacob that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The smoke was too thick, too black to be from a simple cook fire or forge. This was the smoke of burning buildings, of destruction unleashed. Doc Pierce was the first to find his voice. "That's coming from town," he said, his medical training making him instinctively think of casualties, of people who might need help. "Something's wrong. Very wrong." Tom Bradley was already moving toward his horse, his earlier concern about Rex suddenly overshadowed by more immediate threats. "Could be the Hendersons' barn," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "They've been having trouble with that old chimney." But Jacob knew better, and from the expressions on the other men's faces, so did they. The smoke was rising from multiple points, and even at this distance they could see it spreading. This wasn't an accident. "Riders," Mark said suddenly, his young eyes sharper than those of the older men. "Look, coming up the valley trail." Jacob squinted into the distance and spotted them. 3 horsemen riding hard toward the foothills, their horses lathered with sweat and their postures speaking of desperate urgency. Even from this distance he could tell they were pushing their mounts to the limits of endurance. "That's Henderson's boy on the bay," Tom said grimly. "And if he's riding like the devil's behind him." The riders reached the base of the hill and began climbing toward the cabin, their horses slipping and scrambling on the loose stone. Jacob could see now that it was indeed young Billy Henderson, along with 2 other men from the valley he recognized but couldn't immediately name. Billy Henderson was barely 18, but he had the lean build and serious demeanor of someone who had been forced to grow up quickly after his father's death. As the riders approached the clearing, Jacob could see that the boy's face was streaked with soot and his clothes showed scorch marks. "Mr. Bradley, Doc Pierce," Billy called out as soon as he was within earshot. "Thank God we found you. You've got to come back to town, all of you. We're under attack." The words hit like physical blows, stunning the men in the clearing into momentary silence. Attack was a word they all understood, a reality they had all feared, but hoped would pass them by in their remote valley. "Who?" Doc Pierce demanded, his medical bag already in his hand as he prepared for the worst. "Indians?" Billy shook his head, gasping for breath as he struggled to control his winded horse. "Worse! The Kellerman gang! Maybe 15 or 20. Of them, armed to the teeth and meaner than rattlesnakes. They hit us just after dawn, came in from the North Pass like they knew exactly where we'd be weakest." Jacob felt his stomach drop. The Kellerman gang was infamous throughout the territory, a collection of deserters, outlaws, and murderers led by a former Confederate officer named Marcus Kellerman, who had refused to accept the war's end. They specialized in attacking isolated settlements, taking what they wanted and leaving behind only ashes and corpses. "How bad?" Tom Bradley asked, his earlier anger forgotten in the face of genuine crisis. "Bad," Billy replied, wiping soot from his eyes. "They burned the church and half the main street, took hostages, including my ma and Mrs. Fletcher and some of the other women. Said they'd kill them if we tried to follow or bring in outside help." "Why aren't you with the others?" Doc Pierce demanded. "Why come looking for us?" One of the other riders, a man named Collins who worked at the general store, spoke up. Because we need every gun we can get, Doc. Most of the men are either dead or too hurt to fight. Billy's pa organized what's left of us, but we're outnumbered 3-1. And they're dug in good, Billy added. Using the women as shields, picked positions where we can't get at them without risking innocent lives. We need help, and we need it fast. Jacob found himself thinking rapidly, his old military training analyzing the tactical situation. The Kellerman gang was notorious for their brutality, but they were also known for their cunning. They wouldn't attack a settlement unless they were confident they could hold it, which meant they had done their reconnaissance and knew exactly how many fighting men the valley could field. "How many of you are left?" Jacob asked, his mind already shifting into the strategic thinking that had once made him a respected cavalry officer. "Maybe 8 who can still hold a rifle," Collins replied grimly. "Plus Billy here and Old Man. Fletcher, though he's more likely to shoot himself than the enemy. 10 men then, against 15 to 20 experienced killers. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. We have to go," Tom Bradley said, already mounting his horse. "Whatever else is happening here," he glanced meaningfully at Rex, who was still sitting calmly beside Jacob. "It'll have to wait. Our people need us." Doc Pierce nodded, but his eyes remained on Jacob. "What about you? Are you coming?" Jacob looked down at Rex, who was watching the proceedings with the alert interest of an intelligent creature sensing danger. The mountain lion had recovered enough strength to travel, but he was still not at full fighting capacity. More importantly, bringing a mountain lion into a hostage situation would only create more complications in an already impossible scenario. But as Jacob studied the faces of the men around him, men he had known for years, men who had risked their own safety to search for him, he realized that his choice had already been made for him. Rex had taught him something about loyalty, about the bonds that could form between unlikely allies. Now it was time to apply that lesson to the community that had given him a home. "Rex and I are coming with you," Jacob said quietly. The words brought stunned silence to the clearing. Billy Henderson's eyes widened as he noticed the mountain lion for the first time, and his horse shied nervously. "Jacob," Doc Pierce said carefully, "I don't think you understand what you're suggesting. Taking that animal into town in the middle of a crisis." "I understand perfectly," Jacob interrupted. "Kellerman's gang thinks they're dealing with a handful of farmers and shopkeepers. They're not expecting to face a predator that can move through shadows and strike without warning." Tom Bradley stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "You're talking about using a wild animal as a weapon. That's insane, is it?" Jacob asked. "Or is it exactly the kind of unexpected advantage that might save innocent lives?" He looked around the circle of faces, seeing fear, skepticism, and desperate hope warring in their expressions. These were good people facing an impossible situation, and Jacob was asking them to trust not only his judgment, but his partnership with a creature they viewed as a natural enemy. "Besides," Jacob added quietly, touching Rex's head gently, "I think it's time Rex and I proved that sometimes the most dangerous allies are the ones nobody sees coming." The mountain lion looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jacob could swear he saw understanding there, not just of the words, but of the choice they were making together. As the group prepared to ride toward what might be their final battle, Jacob realized that the storm that had brought him and Rex together was only the beginning. The real tempest was waiting in the valley below, and it would test not only their bond, but their very survival. The ride back to Millfield Valley was unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. Rex moved alongside the horses with fluid grace, matching their pace effortlessly despite his recent injuries. The mountain lion seemed to understand the urgency of their mission, his powerful muscles coiling and releasing with each stride as he kept perfect formation with the mounted men. Billy Henderson rode in stunned silence, stealing glances at Rex. Every few yards, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The other riders maintained a careful distance from the mountain lion. their horses nervous but manageable under their experienced hands. As they descended into the valley, the full scope of the devastation became clear. Smoke rose from at least 6 buildings, and the acrid smell of burning wood mixed with something darker, more ominous, that spoke of lives lost. The church steeple was gone, collapsed in a heap of blackened timber, and the main street showed the distinctive pattern of systematic destruction that marked the Kellerman gang's handiwork. "Sweet Jesus," Tom Bradley muttered, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the damage. "They really did a number on us." Jacob's military eye took in the tactical situation automatically. The bandits had chosen their positions well. They controlled the main street from the general store to the livery stable, with clear fields of fire in all directions. The surviving townspeople were pinned down in houses on the outskirts of town, unable to advance without exposing themselves to devastating crossfire. "Where are they holding the hostages?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded cavalry units. Billy pointed toward the general store, its windows boarded up and smoke stains marking where fires had been set and controlled. "In there, mostly. Some in the bank, too. They've got them spread out so we can't hit one group without the others being killed in retaliation." Classic hostage tactics, Jacob thought grimly. Kellerman might be a murderer and a thief, but he was no fool when it came to warfare. They approached the edge of town carefully, using the cover of trees and outbuildings to avoid detection. Jacob could see movement in the bandit-controlled buildings, shadows passing by windows, the glint of rifle barrels tracking potential threats. The outlaws were disciplined and alert, which would make any conventional assault a suicide mission. That was where Rex would make the difference. The surviving townspeople had gathered in the Henderson farmhouse, a sturdy building on the north edge of town with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. As Jacob's group approached, he could see faces pressed to windows, watching their approach with desperate hope. The hope turned to shock, then fear, then confusion, as the watchers realized that Jacob was accompanied by a mountain lion. The reception inside the farmhouse was explosive. Nearly a dozen men crowded the main room, most bearing bandages and the drawn faces of people who had seen too much violence in too short a time. When Jacob entered with Rex padding calmly beside him, the reaction was immediate and visceral. "What in hell?" someone shouted, and Jacob heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked. "Easy," Doc Pierce called out, stepping between the weapons and the mountain lion. "Easy, everyone. This is Jacob's." He paused, searching for the right word. "Partner. He's here to help." "That thing's here to help?" The voice belonged to Jim Fletcher, whose wife was among the hostages. His face was blackened with soot, and his right arm was bound with bloody bandages. "Are you out of your minds?" Rex settled down beside Jacob, his amber eyes tracking the various weapons pointed in his direction but showing no signs of aggression. The mountain lion's calm demeanor seemed to have a slight calming effect on the room, though hands remained on rifle grips. "Listen to me," Jacob said, his voice cutting through the babble of frightened voices. "I know how this looks. I know what you're thinking, but right now Rex is the only advantage we have against Kellerman's gang." "Advantage?" Fletcher's voice cracked with strain. "That's a wild animal. How do we know it won't turn on us the moment things get heated?" Jacob knelt beside Rex and placed his hand on the mountain lion's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of the cat's breathing, the controlled power in those muscles. "Because he's not wild anymore. Not in the way you mean. He understands. Loyalty understands trust, and right now he trusts me." Tom Bradley stepped forward, his earlier opposition to Rex temporarily set aside by the crisis. "Even if that's true, Jacob, how does having a mountain lion help us against 15 armed men?" Jacob stood and moved to the window, studying the layout of the main street. The tactical problem was complex, but not impossible. It just required thinking beyond conventional approaches. "Because they're expecting conventional tactics," he said, his mind working through possibilities. They've positioned themselves to defend against frontal assault, sniper fire, even siege tactics. What they're not expecting is an attack that comes from above, from angles they can't see or predict. He turned back to the room, seeing the first glimmers of understanding in some of the more experienced faces. Rex can move through spaces no human can navigate, Jacob continued. He can climb walls, traverse rooftops, approach targets from directions they'd never think to guard. And he's absolutely silent when he wants to be. Billy Henderson leaned forward, his young face intense with concentration. You mean to use him like a scout? Send him in to gather information? More than that, Jacob replied. I mean to use him as a force multiplier. One man with a rifle can hold a position against multiple attackers, but one mountain lion can neutralize multiple defenders without firing a shot. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. What Jacob was proposing was unlike anything any of them had ever considered, using a wild predator as an active participant in urban combat. It's crazy, Fletcher said finally, but his voice held less conviction than before. Crazy enough that it might work, added Sam Morrison, the blacksmith's apprentice who had taken shrapnel in his leg during the morning's attack. Lord knows. Nothing else we've tried has made a dent. Jacob pulled out his knife and knelt on the floor, beginning to sketch a rough map in the dirt between the floorboards. The other men gathered around as he marked the positions of known bandit strongholds, hostage locations, and potential approach routes. Here's what I'm thinking, he said, his voice taking on the tactical precision of his military days. Rex goes in first, using the rooftops to get behind their positions. He creates chaos, draws their attention, maybe takes out a sentry or two. While they're trying to figure out what's happening, we move in from 3 directions. He marked positions on his crude map with the tip of his knife, showing how a coordinated assault could succeed where individual attempts had failed. The key is timing, Jacob continued. Rex moves fast, but he's not invincible. We have to be ready to exploit the confusion he creates before they can regroup. Tom Bradley studied the map, his tactical experience from the war evident in the way he analyzed angles and fields of fire. It could work, he said slowly, but it depends entirely on that animal doing exactly what you expect him to do. What if he gets confused or scared or decides to run? Jacob looked down at Rex, who was watching the proceedings with the alert intelligence that had characterized their entire partnership. The mountain lion's eyes met his, and Jacob saw something there that he chose to interpret as understanding, as commitment to whatever lay ahead. He won't run, Jacob said with quiet certainty. Rex has never run from anything in his life. He's not going to start now. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as the men considered the plan, weighing desperate hope against ingrained caution. Outside, the smoke continued to rise from their burning town, and somewhere in the bandit-controlled buildings, their wives and daughters waited for rescue that might never come. Finally, Old Man Fletcher spoke for the group. God help us all, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible choices. But I think you're right. It's crazy enough to work. As the men began preparing for the assault, checking weapons, gathering ammunition, saying prayers for loved ones in danger, Jacob found himself alone with Rex near the window. The mountain lion looked up at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jacob could swear he saw not just trust there, but understanding of what they were about to attempt. I know what I'm asking of you, Jacob said quietly, his hand resting on Rex's powerful neck. I know the risks, but these people, my people, they need help that only you can provide. Rex made a soft, chuffing sound, almost like agreement, and leaned into Jacob's touch. In that moment, Jacob understood that their partnership had evolved beyond simple gratitude or mutual survival. They had become something new, something that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. As the sun began to set over Millfield Valley, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape, Jacob and his unlikely ally prepared for a battle that would test not only their bond, but their very survival. The storm that had brought them together was about to give way to something far more dangerous, a reckoning that would determine whether compassion truly could triumph over cruelty in the brutal reality of the frontier. Darkness settled over Millfield Valley like a shroud, providing the cover Jacob and his unlikely ally needed for their desperate gambit. Rex moved through the shadows with the fluid silence of his species, every muscle coordinated in perfect predatory grace. As he approached the enemy-controlled section of town, Jacob watched from his concealed position behind the livery stable, his heart hammering against his ribs as the mountain lion disappeared into the maze of rooftops and alleyways that would serve as his hunting ground. The plan they had devised was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. Rex would eliminate the sentries and create chaos, while Jacob and the other survivors launched their coordinated assault. The first sign that their plan was working came 20 minutes after Rex had vanished into the darkness. A rifle fell from the roof of the general store, clattering briefly against the wooden planks before tumbling to the street below with a muffled thud. No cry of alarm followed, no shout of discovery, just the weapon dropping from nerveless fingers as its owner was silently neutralized. Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He had seen Rex's speed and power, had witnessed the mountain lion's capacity for both gentleness and lethal efficiency. But this was the first time he had seen that power directed against human targets, and the reality was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. A soft whistle, the signal he and Rex had practiced during their planning, drifted from the direction of the bank building. One sentry down, position secured. Jacob felt a surge of fierce pride in his partner's capabilities, tempered by the knowledge that the real test was yet to come. Movement in the shadows caught his attention. Rex appeared briefly on the roof of the saloon, his golden coat nearly invisible against the weathered shingles before disappearing again toward the church ruins. The mountain lion was systematically working his way through the bandit positions, eliminating outer defenses with surgical precision. From his vantage point, Jacob could see into the main street where most of Kellerman's gang had taken positions. They were professional in their alertness, rifles ready, eyes scanning for any sign of conventional attack. What they weren't watching for was death approaching from above, moving with the patience and stealth of nature's most efficient predator. Another whistle, this one from near the church. 2 sentries neutralized. Jacob felt his pulse quicken as the moment for the main assault drew closer. Around him, he could sense the other survivors taking their positions. Tom Bradley and his son approaching from the north. Doc Pierce and Billy Henderson moving up from the south, the remaining townsmen spreading out to create a coordinated assault from multiple directions. But it was Rex who held the key to their success. Rex who would determine whether desperate courage could triumph over superior numbers and firepower. The third sentry never knew what hit him. Jacob caught a glimpse of golden movement on the roof of the mercantile, saw a shadow blur across the moonlit shingles. Then silence. Another rifle clattered to the street, and Jacob knew that Rex had cleared the outer perimeter with devastating efficiency. Now came the dangerous part, moving against the hardened positions where the bulk of Kellerman's gang waited with their hostages. Jacob checked his pocket watch by moonlight. 10:30. In 5 minutes, regardless of Rex's progress, they would begin their assault on the main positions. The coordination was critical. Too early, and Rex might still be exposed to crossfire from defenders they hadn't anticipated. Too late, and the bandits might discover their eliminated sentries and realize they were under attack. A new sound drifted through the night, not the whistle they had agreed upon, but something that made Jacob's blood run cold. It was Rex's hunting cry, the sound a mountain lion makes when stalking prey, but modified in a way Jacob had never heard before. This wasn't the voice of a predator seeking food. This was the sound of a creature declaring war. Somewhere in the bandit-controlled buildings, men began shouting in alarm. Not the organized calls of soldiers responding to an expected threat, but the panicked cries of men who had encountered something beyond their understanding or preparation. What the hell was that? The voice carried clearly through the night air, followed by the sound of running boots and rattling equipment. Something's on the roof. Jenkins. Report. Jenkins. No answer came from the eliminated sentry, and Jacob could hear the fear beginning to creep into the bandits' voices as they realized their outer defenses had been compromised by something they couldn't identify or predict. This was the moment Jacob had been waiting for. The confusion Rex was creating. The gap in their defensive attention that would allow the townsmen to strike. He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the signal for the general assault to begin. The quiet mountain night exploded into chaos as gunfire erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Tom Bradley's distinctive hunting rifle boomed from the north, while Doc Pierce's steady marksmanship began picking off targets from the south. Billy Henderson and the other young men laid down covering fire, their enthusiasm making up for what they lacked in experience. But it was Rex who remained the decisive factor, moving through the bandit positions like a force of nature unleashed. Jacob caught glimpses of the mountain lion as he worked. A golden blur crossing a rooftop, shadow movement in an alley, the brief flash of predatory grace as Rex struck again and again with surgical precision. The bandits, caught between conventional assault from the townsmen and an impossible threat from above, began to break under the pressure. Kellerman's voice could be heard shouting orders, trying to restore discipline to men who were facing something their frontier experience had never prepared them for. Jacob advanced toward the general store, using the chaos Rex was creating to close distance on the main hostage position. Through a broken window, he could see movement inside. Armed men taking defensive positions, women huddled together in terrified silence, and somewhere in the confusion, the voice of Marcus Kellerman himself, trying to regain control of a situation that was spiraling beyond his ability to manage. The sound of splintering wood came from the roof above the general store, followed by screams of genuine terror from inside the building. Rex had found his way into the main stronghold, and the bandits' carefully planned defensive positions were collapsing under assault from an enemy they had never imagined facing. As Jacob prepared for the final phase of their desperate plan, he realized that the storm that had brought him and Rex together had been nothing compared to the tempest they were unleashing together tonight. The question now was whether their partnership could survive what they were about to face in the heart of Kellerman's stronghold, where desperate criminals would make their final stand with innocent lives hanging in the balance. The real test of their bond was about to begin. Jacob burst through the front door of the general store just as Kellerman's remaining men were trying to regroup from Rex's devastating assault from above. The interior was chaos, overturned shelves, scattered merchandise, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixing with fear sweat and spilled lamp oil. Through the confusion, Jacob could see the hostages, 6 women, including Martha Henderson and Doc, Pierce's wife, clustered behind the main counter where they had been used as human shields. Their eyes were wide with terror, but they were alive, and that was what mattered. Marcus Kellerman himself stood in the center of the room, his confederate. Officer's bearing still evident, despite the desperate circumstances. He was a tall man with steel-gray hair and the kind of cold eyes that had seen too much killing. His service revolver was drawn, and he was using Martha Henderson as a shield while trying to track Rex's movements through the store. "Show yourself. You son of a—" Kellerman's curse was cut short as Rex appeared on top of a tall shelf, his golden eyes fixed on the bandit leader with predatory intensity. The mountain lion moved with fluid grace, each step perfectly silent despite the precarious footing. "Sweet Jesus," whispered one of the surviving bandits, a young man who looked like he was beginning to regret his career choices. "What is that?" "Good thing. It's death," Kellerman replied grimly, his professional soldier's mind analyzing this new threat, even as fear crept into his voice. "But it's still just an animal. Animals can be killed." He swung his pistol toward Rex, but before he could fire, Jacob's rifle spoke from the doorway. The bullet splintered wood inches from Kellerman's head, forcing him to duck and lose his sight. "Picture on the mountain lion. Let the women go, Kellerman," Jacob called out, his voice carrying the calm authority he had used to command cavalry units. "This doesn't have to end with more blood." Kellerman's laugh was bitter and without humor. "Doesn't it? I've got 6 dead men outside, killed by that devil cat of yours, and half the territory's lawmen are going to be hunting me before the week's out. I'd say blood is exactly how this has to end." Rex chose that moment to drop silently from the shelf to the floor, landing with the fluid grace that made mountain lions such perfect predators. The sound of his paws touching wood was barely audible, but it was enough to make every person in the room freeze. The mountain lion was magnificent in the lamplight, 8 feet of coiled muscle and predatory intelligence, his amber eyes fixed on Kellerman with unwavering focus. This was Rex as nature had intended him to be, not the wounded creature Jacob had nursed back to health, but an apex predator in his element. "Call him off," Kellerman demanded, pressing his gun against Martha. "Henderson's temple. Call him off, or I start killing hostages." Jacob felt time slow down as the critical moment arrived. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, came down to this single choice. He could order Rex to retreat, could negotiate with Kellerman, could try to find a diplomatic solution that might save everyone. Instead, he did something that surprised even himself. He holstered his rifle. "Rex," Jacob said quietly, his voice carrying the calm confidence that had characterized their entire partnership. "End this. What happened next would be talked about in Millfield Valley for generations to come." Rex moved with speed that defied human comprehension, crossing the distance between shelf and target in a single fluid motion. But instead of attacking Kellerman directly, which would have endangered Martha Henderson, the mountain lion executed a maneuver that spoke of intelligence beyond simple animal instinct. Rex struck the floor beside Kellerman with enough force to shake the entire building. The impact, combined with his hunting roar at point-blank range, created a sensory assault that overwhelmed the bandit leader's nervous system. Kellerman's gun hand jerked involuntarily, his shot going wide, and his grip on Martha Henderson loosened just enough. Jacob was moving before Kellerman's finger finished pulling the trigger, crossing the room in 3 quick strides and tackling the bandit leader away from the hostages. They went down together in a tangle of limbs, fighting for control of the pistol. The remaining bandits, seeing their leader down, and faced with the impossible sight of a mountain lion working in coordination with armed townsmen, made the practical choice. Weapons clattered to the floor as hands went up in surrender. Jacob and Kellerman rolled across the floor, each trying to gain advantage in their desperate struggle. The bandit leader was strong and experienced, but Jacob had something Kellerman didn't, absolute certainty that he was fighting for something worth dying for. The pistol went skittering across the floor, coming to rest near Rex's paws. The mountain lion looked down at the weapon with what Jacob could swear was disdain, then stepped on it with one massive paw, effectively removing it from the fight. That was when Kellerman made his fatal error. Desperate and seeing his advantages evaporating, he drew a hidden knife and lunged at Jacob with the wild fury of a cornered animal. Rex's response was instantaneous and final. The mountain lion moved like golden lightning, intercepting Kellerman's knife thrust and ending the bandit leader's threat with surgical precision. It was over in seconds, clean, efficient, and as merciful as such things could be. Kellerman's silver pocket watch fell from nerveless fingers, its steady ticking marking the end of an era of terror for Millfield Valley. The silence that followed was broken only by the quiet sobbing of the rescued hostages and the distant sounds of the other townsmen securing the remaining bandits. Jacob knelt beside Rex, his hand finding the mountain lion's neck, feeling the steady heartbeat of his extraordinary partner. "It's over," he said quietly. not sure if he was speaking to Rex, to the hostages, or to himself. Outside, the sounds of celebration were beginning as word spread that the Kellerman gang had been defeated. But inside the general store, Jacob found himself looking at Rex with new understanding. They had faced the ultimate test together, not just of their partnership, but of their willingness to risk everything for something greater than themselves. Rex looked back at him with those intelligent amber eyes, and Jacob saw not just the magnificent predator, but the loyal companion who had chosen to trust a lonely human with his life. The bond between them had been forged in compassion, tested in battle and proven unbreakable. As the first townspeople began entering the store to embrace their rescued loved ones, Jacob realized that the storm which had brought them together had been more than weather. It had been destiny, preparing them both for this moment when courage and compassion would triumph over cruelty and fear. The lonely cowboy and the mountain lion had found something neither had known they were searching for, a partnership that transcended every boundary between human and wild, proving that sometimes the most unlikely alliances forge the strongest bonds. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything in Millfield Valley and the autumn. Air carried the familiar scent of wood smoke and changing leaves as Jacob guided Grace along the ridge overlooking the settlement. Beside them, Rex moved with the confident stride of a creature completely at peace with his place in the world. The valley below showed the scars of that terrible night, but also the resilience that had always characterized frontier communities. New buildings stood where the old ones had burned, their fresh timber bright against the weathered structures that had survived the Kellerman gang's assault. The church steeple had been rebuilt taller than before, as if reaching toward heaven in gratitude for deliverance. But the most remarkable change was harder to see from a distance. It was in the way people moved through their daily routines without the constant wariness that had marked their lives before. Children played in the streets without mothers hovering anxiously nearby. Men worked in their fields without rifles constantly within arm's reach. The shadow of fear that had hung over the valley for months had finally lifted. Jacob dismounted near his cabin and began the familiar routine of caring for Grace, but now there were 2 animals to tend. Rex had claimed a spot on the covered porch where he could watch both the valley below and the forest behind, positioning himself as a guardian of the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. The mountain lion had grown sleek and powerful. In the months since the battle, his golden coat gleaming with health and his movements showing no trace of the injury that had first brought them together. But more than his physical recovery, it was Rex's integration into the rhythms of frontier. Life that truly amazed Jacob. The cat had learned to distinguish between friend and potential threat with uncanny accuracy. He would greet familiar visitors with soft, chuffing sounds, but strangers were subjected to careful evaluation before being deemed acceptable. Children from the valley had begun making pilgrimages to Jacob's cabin, drawn by curiosity about the legendary mountain lion who had saved their town. Rex tolerated these visits with remarkable patience, allowing youngsters to observe him from a respectful distance, while never quite letting them forget that he was a wild creature who deserved their respect. Jacob had watched more than one cocky teenager humble himself after meeting those intelligent amber eyes. The relationship between Jacob and the townspeople had also evolved in ways he hadn't expected. Where once he had been the hermit who lived. Apart from the community, he was now sought out for his wisdom, his counsel, and increasingly his friendship. The man who had once chosen solitude over complications found himself hosting Sunday dinners and joining conversations about the future. Of the valley, Doc Pierce had become a regular visitor, fascinated by Rex's behavior and intelligence. The physician spent hours observing the mountain lion, documenting behaviors that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. "He's not domesticated," Doc Pierce had said during one of their conversations. That's not what this is. He's something entirely new, a wild creature who has chosen to form a partnership based on mutual respect and understanding. Tom Bradley, whose initial opposition to Rex had been the most vocal, had surprised everyone by becoming one of the mountain lion's strongest advocates. The blacksmith had even carved a wooden medallion depicting Rex in a pose of noble alertness, which now hung above the bar in the rebuilt saloon as a permanent reminder of the night when courage and compassion had triumphed over cruelty. "That cat saved my boy's life," Tom would tell anyone who would listen, "and probably all our lives. I was wrong to judge him by what he was instead of who he is." The story of Jacob and Rex had spread beyond Millfield Valley, carried by travelers and traders to distant settlements where it grew in the telling. Some versions portrayed Rex as a mystical creature sent by Providence to protect the innocent. Others focused on Jacob's compassion in nursing a wounded enemy back to health. But all the stories shared common themes: the power of trust to bridge impossible divides, the courage required to extend kindness to those who might harm you, and the unexpected strength that could emerge from the most unlikely partnerships. Jacob had received visitors from as far away as Denver and San Francisco, writers and reporters hoping to document the miracle of Millfield Valley. He had turned most of them away, uncomfortable with the idea of turning his and Rex's story into entertainment for distant audiences. This was not a tale to be sensationalized, but a quiet testament to the possibilities that existed when fear was replaced by understanding. As evening settled over the valley, Jacob settled into his chair on the porch, his pipe providing its familiar comfort as he watched the lights begin to twinkle in the settlement below. Rex lay beside him, the mountain lion's breathing slow and peaceful as he dozed in the gathering darkness. The journal lay open on the small table beside Jacob's chair, its pages now filled with observations not just about weather and wildlife, but about the profound changes that had shaped his life. Tonight's entry was brief but significant. A man's true wealth is not measured in gold or land, but in the trust he has earned from those who have every reason to fear him. Jacob had learned that the storm which brought him and Rex together had been more than a random act of weather. It had been an opportunity disguised as a crisis, a chance to discover that compassion could be stronger than caution, that understanding could triumph over instinct, and that the most meaningful partnerships often formed between those who seemed to have nothing in common. The lonely cowboy, who had once preferred the company of animals to people, had discovered that the greatest adventures came not from avoiding human connections, but from building bridges between different worlds. Rex had taught him that trust was not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, and that the courage to extend kindness to a potential enemy could transform both lives in ways that defied explanation. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Jacob found himself thinking about the future. There would be other storms, other challenges, other tests of the bonds they had forged, but whatever came, he and Rex would face it together. The man who had learned to see beyond appearances, and the mountain lion who had chosen to trust in something greater than survival. In the distance, a coyote howled its ancient song to the moon, and Rex lifted his great head to listen. For a moment, Jacob wondered if his partner missed the call of the wild, missed the solitary life that had defined his species for millennia. Then Rex settled back down beside Jacob's chair with a contented sigh, and Jacob understood that some bonds transcended even the deepest instincts. They had found something in each other that neither had known they needed, a partnership that proved that sometimes the most dangerous creatures need saving most, and that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from fighting, but from choosing. To heal, the storm had brought them together, but it was trust that would keep them united, whatever tempests the future might bring.